Boy, fast-moving show. Donald Trump, Orrin Hatch, and now our friend, the great Andy McCarthy, who, of course, is former U.S. Attorney, Assistant U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, best-selling author of Spring Fever, The Illusion of Islamic Democracy, and you read him at National Review, where he's an editor, and PJ Media, where he wrote a great piece that we're going to talk about. And everything fits in, Andy, all your titles, all your expertise, all your experience, because we have not only your piece today that I want to talk about, but also the news of the day with the Democrats in the Senate voting to change the rules of the filibuster. How are you, my friend?
I'm doing fine, Steve. How are you?
Good. Okay, now I'm a little confused, though, I got to tell you, and I don't know if you know the answer to this. Candy Crowley came on and said that this only applies, this was after the president spoke, and went on how, gun legislation and immigration and equal pay for women, and all this has been blocked by the high threshold of the filibuster, implying that this would now be remedied. Candy Crowley came on and said, I don't think the president understands that this only applies to judicial nominees and other nominees. And I asked Orrin Hatch, and he said, no. I said, so it applies to everything? He said, as far as I know. So I don't even know. I guess I believe Hatch more than Crowley, but do you have any inkling?
My understanding, Steve, for now is that it only applies to judicial nominations. And in fact, some of what I understand Reid's people are putting out by the back door is that even though by pushing this today, he basically walked away from everything he has ever said about this issue, which cut exactly the other way and was basically a testament to why we needed the filibuster. Part of why they say they're doing this is because there are people on the left who want an even more sweeping rule change that would do away with the filibuster period and basically make the Senate no different from the House.
Right.
You have majority rules and you could push through anything. So as I understand it, it only applies to, not only does it only apply to judicial nominations, the interpretation I heard is that it only applies to judicial nominations with respect to the lower federal courts, meaning the circuit courts and the district courts. But, I would stress to people that limitation, and this may be what Senator Hatch is getting at, that limitation is illusory, because if they can change this rule on the dime, they can change any rule on the dime.
Right.
It used to be that you needed 67 votes to change the rules.
Right, and that was changed. That filibuster level was changed in the 70s, I think, 75.
Right, but the point is that they're even changing the rules about changing the rules.
Right. As well, the Republicans are saying they violated the rules to change the rules.
Right, and what that ends up meaning is that you basically have the law of the jungle. I mean, if there are no enduring rules, if what we're now dealing with is that you just need a majority to change the rules that have been in effect. Basically, Thomas Jefferson wrote the rules that the Senate operates under. I mean, they've been changed and tweaked over time, but we're dealing with rules that have been in effect for a very, very long time. And if you've now struck a procedure where it only takes 51 votes to change the rule, in effect, you really have no rules.
Right,
because anytime they don't like them, they'll just change them.
Absolutely, yeah. And I want you to listen to what the president said, not only Harry Reid traditionally, but the president as senator, I believe in 2006, about a proposed change in the rules by the Republicans. This is cut 31.
But if the right of free and open debate is taken away from the minority party and the millions of Americans who ask us to be their voice, I fear that the already partisan atmosphere in Washington will be poisoned to the point where no one will be able to agree on anything. That doesn't serve anyone's best interest, and it certainly isn't what the patriots who founded this democracy had in mind. We owe the people who sent us here more than that. We owe them much more.
The Patriots, huh?
Yeah, who was that man, by the way? Yeah, that's striking and stunning in and of itself.
And then he went on to say that it was unpatriotic to raise the debt limit, right?
Well, yep, absolutely. Yeah, he's not the same man he was when he was senator. That's for sure. Okay, let's move on though. Your piece which I just think is brilliant and scary at the same time. I'm using the word scary a lot because when it comes to this president and this administration, the power grab, the changing of the rules, the foreign policy, the fighting alongside and supporting of terrorists that hate us and want to kill us, it's just like we're living in a totally upside-down world, as you and I have been talking about for 5 years now. But you talk about Secretary of State Kerry seeing common ground with the terror regime, the barbaric terror regime, as you put it at PJ Media, of Iran. And I want you to explain that, but I hearken back immediately to what he said in Turkey when he talked about how the Israelis who defended themselves on that flotilla when they were attacked, and they killed, I think, 7 Turkish terrorists or whatever you want to call them. And Kerry said, we know. I'm sorry?
I said terrorist is a good word.
Yeah, and he says, we know how to feel because we just got hit at the Boston Marathon. And he compared innocent victims watching a race to the terrorists that Israel had to kill to defend their people on the ships. So I'm not surprised by what you wrote about, but it makes me sick. Tell the folks what you wrote about.
Yeah, Kerry is, I mean, it's hard to come up with words to describe Kerry.
French.
I don't want to say that about the French.
That's right. They're holding out for Iran. That's true.
Yeah. They at least have the courage of their convictions.
But I mean, he calls, he always thinks of himself as French. That's why I say that.
Right. But what Kerry said this time around, and every statement he makes seemingly is mind-boggling, beginning with the one last week about how I don't think we're stupid, which I think needs to be rethought by him as well. But what he said recently, within the last few days, is that there's common ground between the United States and Iran because Iran has just now suffered an attack by Al-Qaeda on one of its diplomatic facilities. The embassy, the Iranian embassy in Lebanon. And I guess what I tried to point out in my column is 2 things. Number one, Iran has been attacking American embassies for 30 years and American diplomatic installations and American personnel overseas, possibly even in the United States. In fact, the Iranian regime was born out of an attack in 1979 on the American embassy in Iran. So for Kerry to make a statement like that is sort of mind-boggling. The other point, Steve, is that Al-Qaeda became Al-Qaeda as we know it today because of Iran. Al-Qaeda struck up a relationship with Iran in the early 1990s, basically right after bin Laden took the jihad global and anti-American after the Afghan Mujahideen drove the Russians out of Afghanistan.
Yeah.
So, Al-Qaeda became the Al-Qaeda as we know it because it was trained and funded and harbored by Iran and Hezbollah. One of Osama bin Laden's big imperatives in the early days was to encourage that Shiites and Sunnis put aside their enmity for each other and unite against the common enemy, the United States. And that gave birth to the relations that Iran has had pretty continuously up until very recently with Al-Qaeda. And as you and I have talked about before, you know that I've strongly argued against the United States intervening in Syria. And one of the big reasons for that is that by us staying out of it, we actually have our enemies turning on each other. That's why Al-Qaeda is now bombing Iran. But the thought that we have common ground with Iran and that we're going to not only overlook Iran's history, but also Iran's very particular history of aiding and abetting and essentially creating the Al-Qaeda as we know it today is just, it boggles the mind.
Yeah, and Al-Qaeda and Hezbollah and our dead Marine on the tarmac and the embassy and it goes on and on and on. But, it's just an extension. This president was dying to shake this guy's hand who had blood all over it, American blood. Doesn't stop him. Next we'll be training their Republican Guard. I'm sure that's in the offing.
Right, and who is saying these things? Kerry, the guy who in 2005 accused American troops in Iraq of terrorism.
Yep.
Now looks at an actual terrorist regime and empathizes.
It is insane. You can't. It is, Andy. I don't even know what you and I. We banged our heads and scratched. We've scratched our heads over the years. But now I think, we're banging them because we're just banging them.
I had so long I used to have hair up there.
And listen, by the way, Ezra Klein writes, and thanks to Rich, our fine producer, the change in the Senate made today is small but consequential. The filibuster no longer applies to judicial or executive branch nominees. It still applies to bills and Supreme Court nominations. But he went on to make your point, Andy, that but the first time any significant legislation is filibustered and needs the 60 and doesn't get it, they'll just blow it up.
Right.
Yeah. So that's where we are.
Steve, expect them to put the pedal to the metal between now and next January because they got a wipeout coming, I think, in the 2014 election. So they're going to go for whatever they can get from here on out. That's
what I don't get. I don't get it. They know that because if they're willing to do this and try to and they can push forward nominations and stuff, which will have a significant effect. Talking about judges' lifetime appointments on a very important bench when it comes to regulations. But nonetheless, the House could thwart legislation even if they ram it through the Senate with 51 votes. So I just think there's something really nefarious here, and it's just scary to me. That's all.
I would point out to people, as I mentioned this National Review today. The framers give us tools to deal with this, but if the Republicans won't use them, then this becomes like a runaway freight train. Courts can't operate unless the House of Representatives funds them. And just because the Constitution puts Congress in charge of whether we have these lower federal courts, and just because Congress establishes them doesn't mean that they're permanent or they have to be forever. They can be disestablished as well.
So, okay, so the House could then say we're not going to fund the courts that you're,
stacking.
You
might have a shutdown of the government over it, but there are ways to fight back.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't hold my breath because they're riding the wave of the health care, but it is frightening that these people could be appointed for a lifetime and these Obama regulations could be in place and hold constitutional muster because of these judges for decades to come. Andy, always a pleasure. Thank you for your time, sir.
Thank you, Steve.
Take care. Andy McCarthy, ladies and gentlemen, and read his book if you haven't read Spring Fever, The Illusion of Islamic Democracy. It's out in paperback, bestseller. So many bestsellers from Andy McCarthy on jihad and the Islamic world. And, of course, he helped put the blind sheik in jail. And don't think the blind sheik, don't think that before Barack Obama leaves office, don't think that as part of some deal somewhere, somehow, or just gratuitously, Barack Obama will release the blind sheik from a New York State prison or federal prison in New York City, by the way, and release him back to wherever the heck he came from. Don't think. He's the man responsible for the first World Trade Center bombing. But that wasn't so bad. Only a handful of people got killed, right? I mean, how long you going to hold a grudge? The guy's blind after all, right? He deserves a little freedom. I'm telling you, that's coming. You wait. You wait. All right, folks. So when we come back, Susan Ferricchio, Chief Congressional Correspondent, Washington Examiner, will go in depth again on the filibuster and the change and the nuclear option passed by Harry Reid and all but 3 Democrats, I believe, in the Senate when we return right here on the Steve Malzberg Show, Newsmax.